In October 54 AD, the Roman Empire passed into the hands of Nero following the death of Emperor Claudius. Nero was approximately 16 years old. His accession did not mark a rupture in Roman governance, nor did it signal the beginning of ideological experimentation or religious confrontation. The transition of power occurred within established Julio-Claudian norms, supported by senatorial ratification and the continuity of imperial institutions. At the moment of accession, there was no identifiable crisis, no public unrest, and no indication that the new emperor intended to depart from prevailing administrative practices. The early years of Nero's reign were defined by the dominance of experienced advisors, most notably Lucius Annaeus Seneca and Sextus Afranius Burrus. Their influence ensured that imperial governance between 54 and 59 AD remained institutionally conservative. Legislative processes continued through the Senate. Judicial authority was exercised within customary frameworks. Provincial administration functioned without disruption. The imperial court, while youthful in appearance, did not immediately abandon restraint. Contemporary Roman observers did not characterize these years as chaotic or despotic, but rather as stable and predictable. During this period, the Roman state maintained a pragmatic approach to religion. Roman religion was civic in nature, embedded in public ritual, ancestral custom, and contractual reciprocity between gods and state. It was not governed by doctrines of belief, nor by modern concepts of religious freedom or persecution. Religious practice was regulated insofar as it intersected with public order, civic loyalty, and social stability. Cults that respected these boundaries were accommodated, regardless of theological divergence. Judaism occupied a recognized position within this system. Jewish communities throughout the empire were granted exemptions from participation in certain civic cults, including emperor worship, in exchange for political loyalty and communal discipline. These exemptions were the product of long-standing negotiation and precedent, not philosophical tolerance. They were administrative arrangements designed to manage differences without provoking unrest. It was within this protected legal and social space that early Christianity existed during Nero's early reign. Between 54 and 59 AD, Christianity did not exist as a legally distinct entity in Roman eyes. Roman administrators did not classify Christians as adherents of a separate religion. No legal terminology distinguished them from Jewish communities. To Roman officials, disputes involving followers of Jesus of Nazareth appeared, when they appeared at all, as internal disagreements within Judaism. These disputes did not rise to the level of imperial concern. They were handled locally, socially, or not at all. This administrative invisibility is a critical historical condition. Christianity was not persecuted during this period because it was not yet perceived. It had not crossed the threshold at which the Roman state intervened. There were no investigations, no arrests, no decrees, and no recorded hostility directed at Christians by the imperial government in the first 5 years of Nero's reign. Silence in the sources here is not a gap to be filled with speculation. It is itself evidence of political irrelevance. The Roman state did not monitor religious movements for doctrinal deviation. It responded to disorder. Groups became visible to the authority when they disrupted public life, challenged civic ritual, or threatened loyalty to the emperor. Christianity between 54 and 59 AD did none of these in a manner detectable at the imperial level. Its gatherings were small, private, and socially marginal. Its refusal to participate in certain rituals did not yet generate confrontation because it was subsumed within Jewish exemption structures. Nero himself exhibited no recorded interest in religious reform during this phase. His public actions focused on consolidating legitimacy, maintaining elite cooperation, and projecting continuity with his predecessors. Coinage, public ceremonies, and official pronouncements emphasized stability rather than innovation. There is no evidence that Nero articulated a religious agenda, positive or negative, during these years. To attribute later developments backward into this period is to distort the chronological record. The Senate retained a visible role in governance. Although imperial authority ultimately rested with the princeps, senatorial consent remained a functional mechanism. Legal decisions followed established procedures. Political executions, purges, and extraordinary measures that would characterize later phases of Nero's reign were absent. The machinery of state remained intact, and restraint was not yet abandoned. This context is essential for understanding what did not happen. Nero did not inherit a policy of hostility toward Christianity. He did not receive reports identifying Christians as a threat. He did not begin his reign with an intention to suppress religious minorities. None of these conditions existed. The early church did not occupy the mental or administrative landscape of the Roman court. Roman religious administration operated reactively rather than preemptively. It intervened when compelled by crisis. In the absence of a crisis, it left marginal groups alone. Christianity in this period was marginal in the most literal sense, small, socially peripheral, and politically insignificant. Its adherents did not yet form a category requiring regulation. The absence of conflict during these years also demonstrates that later persecution was not inevitable. The Roman system did not naturally or automatically move toward the repression of Christianity. Something had to change for that to occur. This period also clarifies the nature of Roman power. Authority was exercised through precedent, not ideology. There was no doctrine of religious uniformity. There was no state theology demanding enforcement. Compliance was measured by behavior, not belief. Loyalty was demonstrated through participation in civic life, not private conviction. Christianity had not yet been framed as incompatible with these expectations. The importance of this phase lies not in dramatic events, but in structural normalcy. Nero's early reign shows a Roman system functioning as designed. It tolerated differences when differences posed no threat. It intervened only when the order was challenged. Understanding this normalcy is essential because it prevents retrospective moral narratives from flattening historical causation. By the end of 59 AD, the empire had not yet encountered the crisis that would alter this equilibrium. Christianity remained beneath the radar of power. Nero remained constrained by institutional structures. The relationship between emperor and church, which later generations would retroactively dramatize, did not yet exist. By the late 40s AD, a small number of followers of Jesus of Nazareth were already present in the city of Rome. Their arrival did not result from organized missionary planning or centralized direction, but from the ordinary movement of people within the Roman Mediterranean. Rome was the largest urban center in the empire, drawing migrants, merchants, slaves, and freed persons from across the provinces. Jewish communities were well established in the city by the 1st century, concentrated primarily in districts along the Tiber. It was within these Jewish networks that early Christian adherents emerged. At this stage, Christianity did not exist as a discrete public identity. Roman authorities possessed no category for Christian as a religious classification. Individuals who believed that Jesus was the Messiah remained embedded within Jewish communal life, participating in synagogues, observing ancestral customs, and maintaining social ties with other Jews. The distinctions that would later separate Christianity from Judaism had not yet hardened into administrative or legal boundaries. What existed were internal disagreements over interpretation, authority, and identity, none of which attracted sustained imperial attention. Roman governance did not operate by monitoring belief. It responded to conduct that affected public order. Religious life in the city was diverse and crowded with cults, associations, and philosophical schools. Many groups met privately, shared meals, and practiced rituals unfamiliar to outsiders. Such practices were not inherently suspect. What drew scrutiny was disruption, riots, refusal to comply with civic obligations, or challenges to imperial authority. The Christian groups of the 40s and 50s AD produced none of these effects at a scale detectable to Roman administration. The only indirect evidence for Christian presence in Rome before Nero's reign comes from disturbances during the time of Emperor Claudius. Suetonius records that Claudius expelled certain Jews from Rome because of constant unrest instigated at the instigation of Chrestus. This reference has long been debated. What can be stated with confidence is limited. The disturbances were internal to Jewish communities. Roman authorities did not identify Christians as a separate population, nor did they prosecute individuals for adherence to Christian belief. The expulsion targeted Jews broadly and temporarily, not Christians specifically. Whatever disputes lay behind the unrest, they were treated as matters of communal discipline rather than religious deviation. After Claudius died in 54 AD, Jews gradually returned to Rome. Along with them returned those Jewish adherents who followed Jesus. Their social position did not change. They remained marginal, poor, and largely invisible. Their meetings continued to take place in private homes. Leadership structures were informal and localized. No central authority coordinated belief or practice across the city. There was no public face of Christianity for Roman officials to encounter or assess. Social suspicion toward Christians did exist, but it was limited and diffuse. It arose from the same sources that generated suspicion toward other marginal groups: secrecy, exclusivity, and unconventional behavior. Christians met behind closed doors. They referred to one another as family across lines of status and ethnicity. They abstained from certain civic rituals, not as a political statement, but as an extension of Jewish custom and belief. These behaviors were noted by neighbors, not by magistrates. They produced rumors rather than regulations. It is essential to distinguish between popular perception and state action. Roman crowds could be hostile without prompting a legal response. Neighborhood gossip, mockery, or resentment did not automatically translate into investigation or punishment. The Roman state intervened selectively and pragmatically. Before 64 AD, there is no evidence of arrests, interrogations, trials, or executions of Christians in Rome. No governor reported on them. No senatorial decree mentioned them. No imperial correspondence addressed them. Their presence remained beneath the threshold of political concern. This invisibility was reinforced by Christianity's continued association with Judaism. Jewish communities were granted certain accommodations under Roman rule, including exemption from participation in imperial cult rituals. These exemptions were the result of long negotiation and precedent, not ideological tolerance. Christians benefited indirectly from these arrangements so long as they were perceived as Jews. The Roman state did not examine theological distinctions closely enough to separate them. The absence of repression during this period demonstrates that persecution was not the default Roman response to religious difference. Christianity did not provoke attention simply by existing. It became visible only when external circumstances forced Roman authorities to search for explanations or scapegoats. Until that moment, the movement remained socially marginal and politically insignificant. Within Christian memory, this period would later be remembered as a time of quiet growth and internal consolidation. Historically, however, it was a period of obscurity. Christian groups lacked numbers, influence, and organization. They possessed no public standing. They were not perceived as competitors to Roman religion or threats to imperial stability. Their beliefs were unknown to most of the city's population and irrelevant to those who governed it. The years between approximately 49 and 64 AD represent a phase of equilibrium. Christianity existed in Rome without provoking a state response. Roman authorities governed without reference to Christianity. The two did not meaningfully intersect. This equilibrium was fragile not because of inherent tension, but because it depended on the absence of crisis. As long as the Roman state had no reason to single out a marginal group, it did not do so. Understanding this phase is essential to avoiding distortion. Later narratives often assume a continuous hostility between Rome and the Church from the beginning. The evidence does not support this assumption. There was no gradual escalation toward persecution. There was no developing policy. There was only indifference. By 64 AD, Christianity had not yet crossed the threshold into Roman political consciousness. It had not become a legal problem, a social menace, or an ideological rival. It was simply one among many small, obscure movements occupying the margins of an enormous city. Its fate would change only when circumstances external to the movement itself forced Roman power to take notice. In 59 AD, the political character of the Roman Principate under Nero entered a decisive phase. The killing of Agrippina the Younger removed the most significant internal constraint on imperial authority. Agrippina had not functioned as a symbolic maternal presence, but as an active political actor with independent networks of influence. Her removal did not signal irrational cruelty or personal excess. It marked the resolution of an unstable dual authority that Roman political culture could not sustain. From this point forward, power flowed more directly through the emperor's person. The consolidation that followed was neither sudden nor illegal. Roman imperial authority had always rested on a combination of formal office, precedent, and personal dominance. Nero's actions between 59 and 64 AD intensified tendencies already embedded in the Principate. Decision-making narrowed. Access to the emperor became more controlled. Administrative discretion increasingly replaced shared consultation. These shifts did not dismantle the machinery of state, but they altered its balance. The Senate remained operational during this period, yet its role changed in substance. Formal procedures continued, debates were held, and decrees were issued. What diminished was the Senate's capacity to shape outcomes independently. Senators adjusted to the new reality through compliance rather than confrontation. This accommodation was not imposed solely through terror, but through incentives, favors, and selective pressure. The erosion of senatorial influence was gradual and largely procedural. Legal mechanisms played a central role in this process. Charges of treason, long embedded in Roman law, expanded in scope and application. These prosecutions were not indiscriminate. They targeted members of the elite whose loyalty appeared uncertain or whose influence posed a potential challenge. The purpose was not mass repression, but deterrence. By demonstrating that proximity to power carried risk, the regime reinforced dependence on imperial favor. The presence of law must be emphasized. Nero did not rule outside legal frameworks. Roman law was elastic, capable of accommodating coercive practices without abandoning formal legitimacy. Trials were conducted. Accusations followed recognized categories. Punishments were imposed through established channels. The appearance of legality mattered because it preserved continuity even as authority centralized. Administrative continuity extended beyond Rome. Provincial governance continued to function with minimal disruption. Taxation, military command, and local administration remained intact. There is no evidence of systemic breakdown during these years. The empire's vast territories did not experience widespread instability. This stability underscores the nature of consolidation as an internal recalibration rather than a collapse of governance. The imperial court became a more prominent site of power. Access to the emperor determined influence. Advisors rose and fell based on proximity rather than institutional position. This personalization of authority increased the volatility of political life. Decisions depended more heavily on the emperor's immediate circle, reducing predictability. Yet this too conformed to existing imperial patterns rather than inventing new ones. The removal of Agrippina also altered the symbolic landscape of rule. The emperor no longer shared the stage with a dominant maternal figure. Public representation emphasized Nero's autonomy. Coinage, ceremonies, and appearances reinforced the image of a sole ruler. Symbolic clarity supported political consolidation by eliminating ambiguity about where authority resided. It is essential to resist moral dramatization of this phase. Ancient sources, particularly senatorial authors, framed consolidation as degeneration. Their hostility reflects political displacement as much as objective assessment. A critical reading must separate rhetorical condemnation from structural description. Nero's consolidation was neither unprecedented nor uniquely monstrous. It followed a logic familiar to Roman imperial politics. The expansion of coercive capacity did not eliminate negotiation. Elite cooperation remained necessary. The emperor relied on networks of patronage to maintain support. Rewards accompanied punishments. Offices, honors, and financial benefits were distributed strategically. Consolidation functioned through a combination of pressure and incentive, not through raw force alone. By the early 60s AD, institutional restraint had weakened but not vanished. Advisors continued to operate. Bureaucratic routines persisted. The empire did not yet experience the shocks associated with later instability. What changed was the margin of safety. With fewer internal constraints, the regime's response to future crises would be more discretionary and more severe. The significance of this period lies in how it reshaped decision-making. Power became more centralized, more personalized, and more reactive. These characteristics did not predetermine later outcomes, but they altered the range of available responses. When confronted with stress, a consolidated regime could act swiftly and harshly without broad consultation. It is important to note what this consolidation did not involve. It did not introduce ideological programs. It did not target religious groups. It did not pursue cultural purification. Its focus remained on political stability and elite control. Any attempt to attribute religious motives to these actions misunderstands both Roman priorities and the available evidence. The years between 59 and 64 AD, therefore, represent a transformation in governance style rather than a rupture in governance itself. The emperor's authority expanded within the bounds of Roman practice. Legal tools were sharpened. Institutional counterweights weakened. Administrative continuity masked underlying shifts in power distribution. This transformation increased the regime's capacity for coercion while preserving its outward normalcy. The empire continued to function. Daily life proceeded. Most inhabitants experienced no immediate change. The significance of consolidation lay not in visible upheaval, but in altered internal dynamics. By the summer of 64 AD, the Roman state remained outwardly stable but inwardly reconfigured. Authority had concentrated. Restraints had loosened. Decision-making had narrowed. These conditions did not compel a specific course of action, but they shaped the context in which decisions would be made. When extraordinary circumstances arose, the regime's capacity for measured response would be tested. In July 64 AD, Rome experienced one of the most destructive urban catastrophes in its recorded history. The fire broke out in the southeastern districts of the city, near the Circus Maximus, an area dense with wooden structures, narrow streets, workshops, and warehouses. Once ignited, the blaze spread rapidly, driven by summer heat, wind, and the physical layout of the city. Rome was not constructed for fire containment. Buildings stood close together. Streets functioned as channels rather than barriers. Firefighting capabilities were limited and decentralized. Under these conditions, containment proved impossible. The fire burned for several days before subsiding, only to reignite in other quarters. By the time it was extinguished, large portions of Rome had been destroyed or severely damaged. Entire neighborhoods were reduced to rubble. Temples, public buildings, and private dwellings alike were affected. Thousands were displaced. The material losses were immense. This was not an ordinary urban fire, but an event of exceptional scale that altered the physical and social landscape of the capital. Ancient sources differ in detail, but they agree on the magnitude of destruction. The fire reshaped Rome in ways that demanded immediate response from the imperial administration. Emergency measures were required to address homelessness, food shortages, and public disorder. The crisis was not only humanitarian, it was political. Rome's identity as the center of the empire had been visibly scarred, and responsibility for recovery rested with the emperor. The causes of the fire remain historically indeterminate. No contemporary account provides definitive evidence identifying an origin or assigning responsibility. Fires were common in ancient cities, particularly in Rome, where construction materials and population density created a persistent risk. The question of causation was inseparable from the question of perception. In the aftermath of the disaster, public attention turned quickly toward the imperial household. Suspicion emerged almost immediately. Rumors circulated that the fire had not been accidental, that it had been allowed to spread, or even that it had been ordered. These suspicions did not arise in a vacuum. They were shaped by existing tensions, by the scale of destruction, and by the visibility of imperial rebuilding projects that followed. The fact that no proof existed did not prevent speculation. In times of crisis, rumors filled the void left by uncertainty. The emperor responded with relief measures. Temporary shelters were opened. Grain supplies were distributed. Efforts were made to stabilize the city and prevent further unrest. These actions were necessary and visible, but they did not dissolve suspicion. Relief could address immediate suffering, but it could not resolve the deeper problem of legitimacy. The question of blame remained unresolved, and unresolved blame posed a threat to authority. The rebuilding of Rome intensified this problem. Reconstruction plans introduced new building regulations, wider streets, and restrictions on materials. These measures had practical benefits, but they also carried political costs. The scale of imperial construction, particularly projects associated with the palace complex later known as the Domus Aurea, fueled the perception that destruction had created opportunity. Whether this perception was fair or unfounded is secondary to its political effect. Suspicion hardened as rebuilding progressed. Ancient historians record that public opinion did not settle into a single narrative. Some accepted the fire as accidental. Others believed it was the result of negligence. Still others suspected deliberate action. What matters historically is not which view was correct, but that uncertainty persisted. Authority depends on confidence. In July 64 AD, confidence eroded. The fire exposed the vulnerability of imperial legitimacy. The emperor was expected to protect the city, to maintain order, and to embody stability. When catastrophe struck, failure to control explanation became as damaging as failure to control flames. The Roman political system lacked mechanisms for transparent investigation. In the absence of formal inquiry, perception became reality. The historian Tacitus records that rumors accused the emperor of involvement, but he does not present these accusations as proven fact. His account reflects senatorial hostility and retrospective moral judgment. It must be read critically, not dismissed. Tacitus provides evidence of suspicion, not evidence of guilt. This distinction is essential for historical accuracy. Other ancient writers offer different emphases, some hostile, some anecdotal, some derivative. None provides conclusive proof regarding the fire's origin. Later legends, including stories of theatrical performance during the blaze, belong to a tradition of moralizing narrative rather than contemporary documentation. Such legends reflect how memory reshaped the event, not how the event unfolded. What can be stated with confidence is that the fire created a crisis of explanation. In Rome, disasters demanded meaning. Fires were not merely accidents. They were interpreted as failures of governance or signs of divine displeasure. The imperial system was structured around the expectation that the emperor could manage both reality and perception. In July 64 AD, that expectation was tested and found wanting. The scale of displacement amplified the problem. Tens of thousands were left without shelter. Crowded conditions increased tension. Economic disruption affected supply chains and labor. In such an environment, rumors spread rapidly. Social cohesion weakened. The risk of unrest grew. The administration required a means to redirect anger away from the imperial center. It is at this point that political calculation became unavoidable. Authority in Rome was personal. When catastrophe struck, blame gravitated toward the emperor unless deflected. The system did not provide buffers. Responsibility and power were intertwined. To preserve order, the narrative surrounding the fire had to be stabilized. This stabilization did not require proof. It required plausibility. The Roman public did not demand judicial certainty. It demanded an explanation that restored moral balance. Scapegoating functioned as a political tool in such circumstances, not because it was just, but because it was effective. The fire marks a turning point not because of its physical destruction alone, but because it altered the political environment. It created conditions in which extraordinary measures could be taken under the guise of necessity. It narrowed the range of acceptable responses. It forced decisions that would not have been required in normal circumstances. It is crucial to emphasize what the fire did not do. It did not automatically compel violence. It did not dictate a specific target. It did not transform imperial policy by itself. The fire created pressure. How that pressure was resolved depended on the choices made afterward. By the end of the summer of 64 AD, Rome had entered a new phase. Reconstruction was underway. Relief efforts continued. But the question of responsibility remained unresolved. The political environment had changed. The equilibrium that had allowed marginal groups to remain unnoticed was no longer stable. In the months following the Great Fire of Rome in July 64 AD, the Roman state confronted a problem that relief measures and reconstruction plans could not resolve. The physical destruction of the city had produced not only homelessness and economic disruption, but a crisis of legitimacy. Rumor, suspicion, and resentment circulated widely, directed toward the imperial center. In a political system where authority was personal and symbolic, unresolved blame posed a direct threat to stability. It was within this context that the first state-sponsored violence against Christians occurred. The decision to punish Christians did not arise from legal precedent or religious policy. Christianity was not illegal under Roman law. No statute prohibited adherence to Christian belief, and no imperial decree defined Christians as criminals. The actions taken in 64 to 65 AD operated in a legal gray zone, shaped by discretionary power rather than codified procedure. Roman governance allowed for such discretion in moments of perceived emergency, particularly when public order was at risk. Christians presented a uniquely vulnerable target. They were small in number, lacked elite patrons, and possessed no recognized legal status independent of Judaism. Their gatherings were private, their practices poorly understood, and their social reputation already strained by rumor. They did not participate fully in civic cults, and they maintained internal solidarity that outsiders interpreted as secrecy. These characteristics did not make them dangerous in political terms, but they made them defenseless. The keystone account of the persecution comes from Tacitus, writing several decades later. Tacitus records that blame for the fire was shifted onto a group known as Christians, who were already hated for their abominations. His phrasing is precise and revealing. Christians were not convicted because the evidence demonstrated guilt. They were punished because they were already despised. Hatred preceded accusation, and accusation substituted for proof. Tacitus further notes that the charge of arson was widely understood to be a pretext. The punishments imposed were therefore not perceived as justice, but as spectacle. Christians were executed publicly in ways designed to absorb collective anger and redirect it away from the emperor. Crucifixion, exposure to wild animals, and burning were all employed. These methods were not inventions of this moment. They were established Roman penal practices. What distinguished their use here was scale, visibility, and theatricality. The violence was localized to Rome. There is no evidence that provincial governors enacted similar measures, nor that instructions were issued beyond the city. The persecution was not empire-wide, and it did not initiate a sustained campaign. It was a contained response to a specific political crisis. Once that crisis eased, the violence subsided. This containment is essential to understanding the episode accurately. Public reaction to the executions was not uniformly supportive. Tacitus records that pity emerged, not because the Christians were admired, but because the punishments were perceived as excessive. The cruelty of the spectacle undermined its intended function. Instead of restoring confidence, it revealed the arbitrary nature of the response. This reaction underscores the political miscalculation involved. Scapegoating can stabilize authority only if it appears proportionate. In this case, it did not. The Roman state did not require confessions of belief to punish Christians. Identity itself was sufficient. This is a critical development. Punishment for the name alone, as later Roman correspondents would phrase it, did not yet exist as doctrine, but it was practiced here in effect. Christians were not required to prove loyalty or renounce belief. They were selected, accused, and eliminated because their identity made them plausible culprits in the public imagination. The mechanisms of persecution were administrative rather than mob-driven. Executions occurred under state authority, even if they lacked formal legislative backing. This was not a spontaneous lynching. It was organized violence sanctioned by those in power. The distinction matters. State violence establishes precedent in ways popular violence does not. By acting through official channels, the regime demonstrated that extraordinary punishment could be deployed without legal reform. It is important to resist the temptation to inflate the scale of the persecution. No ancient source provides numbers. Later Christian tradition would amplify the episode, but such amplification reflects memory, not measurement. What can be stated is limited. Multiple Christians were executed publicly in Rome over a short period. The impact of the event derives not from body count, but from its symbolic and procedural implications. This episode did not arise from theological hostility. There is no evidence that Christian beliefs were examined, debated, or condemned. The Roman state did not articulate an ideological opposition to Christianity. The persecution functioned as a political maneuver, not as a religious campaign. Christians were chosen because they were expendable, not because they were understood. The selection of Christians also reflects the structure of the Roman social hierarchy. Groups with patrons, numbers, or legal recognition could resist or negotiate. Christians possessed none of these protections. Their marginality made them useful. This logic was not unique to Nero's reign. It was embedded in Roman crisis management. What makes this episode distinctive is that it marks the first time Christians were drawn into that logic. The persecution also revealed the limits of Roman legalism. The law was flexible, but legitimacy depended on perception. By punishing Christians without proof, the regime exposed the gap between legal form and political necessity. This exposure weakened, rather than strengthened, imperial authority in the eyes of some observers. Tacitus's own disapproval reflects elite discomfort with the use of arbitrary violence. Once the immediate crisis passed, the persecution ended. There is no evidence of continued arrests or executions once blame had been redirected and reconstruction advanced. The absence of a follow-up policy confirms the episodic nature of the event. It was not the beginning of a sustained repression, but a singular response to extraordinary circumstances. Nevertheless, the historical significance of the episode is substantial. For the first time, Christians were punished by the Roman state as a group. The precedent was established that Christians could be targeted when politically convenient. Even without legislation, the example endured. Later officials would recall, reinterpret, and adapt this logic under different conditions. The Christians who suffered during this episode did not possess a theology of martyrdom comparable to later centuries. Their deaths were not framed as redemptive acts by the state, nor were they intended to strengthen Christian identity. The Roman purpose was deterrence and deflection, not annihilation or conversion. Any later meaning attached to these deaths developed after the fact. This distinction matters for historical clarity. The persecution did not create Christianity, nor did it define Christian belief. It revealed how vulnerable the movement was to state power when circumstances shifted. It also demonstrated how quickly indifference could become violence in a discretionary system. By the end of 65 AD, the episode had run its course. Rome continued to rebuild. The emperor's position stabilized, at least temporarily. Christians returned to obscurity, diminished but not eliminated. No law recorded their punishment, yet the memory of state violence remained. The first imperial persecution of Christians was brief, localized, and improvised. Its importance lies in what it demonstrated: that identity without protection could become guilt without proof, and that the Roman state could deploy violence without transforming its legal framework. This lesson would outlast the reign in which it was first taught. In the period following the violence directed against Christians in Rome after the Great Fire, early Christian memory places the deaths of two leading figures of the movement in the imperial capital. These figures were Peter and Paul. Their executions are situated within the latter part of Nero's reign, most plausibly after 64 AD, and before the emperor's death in June 68 AD. What can be established historically depends on careful separation between Roman silence, early Christian testimony, and later synthesis. No Roman administrative record names either Peter or Paul. No surviving decree, trial transcript, or senatorial notice records their arrests or executions. This absence is not exceptional. Roman documentation of individual executions, even of prominent figures outside the senatorial elite, was rarely preserved. The silence of Roman sources does not negate the events themselves. It defines the limits within which historical reconstruction must operate. Early Christian sources, however, converge on Rome as the location of both deaths. The earliest testimony comes from the Roman Christian community itself, writing within living memory of the events. This testimony does not present detailed narratives. It does not dramatize the executions or assign explicit legal charges. Instead, it situates the deaths within a period of suffering experienced by the Roman Christian community. The emphasis is communal rather than biographical. The convergence of sources from different regions strengthens the core claim. Christian writers outside Rome, drawing on local tradition rather than Roman propaganda, also locate the deaths of Peter and Paul in the capital. These testimonies emerge independently and are not products of a single narrative center. While they vary in detail, they align in geography and general chronology. This convergence provides historical weight even in the absence of Roman documentation. What cannot be established is precise dating. Attempts to assign exact years, months, or days exceed the evidence. The most defensible placement situates both executions after the persecution triggered by the fire of 64 AD and before the end of Nero's reign. This window reflects both the political context and the internal chronology of early Christian memory. Narrower precision cannot be justified. Equally important is what the sources do not claim. There is no evidence that Nero personally ordered the deaths of Peter or Paul by name. There is no indication that they were singled out because of their leadership roles. The Roman state did not conduct a targeted purge of Christian leadership. Executions occurred within a broader climate of repression, not as part of a strategy aimed at dismantling the movement's hierarchy. The legal context of these executions must be approached with restraint. Roman penal practice distinguished between citizens and non-citizens, and execution methods varied accordingly. Later Christian tradition associates Paul, a Roman citizen, with execution by beheading, and Peter, not a citizen, with crucifixion. These associations are consistent with Roman legal norms. They are plausible. They are also traditional rather than directly attested. The historical method requires that plausibility be acknowledged without converting it into certainty. The absence of detailed legal charges is likewise significant. There is no evidence that Peter or Paul were tried for arson, sedition, or treason, nor is there evidence that their beliefs were examined as such. If their executions occurred within the same climate that produced the earlier persecution, then identity rather than proven offense likely determined their fate. This conclusion aligns with the broader pattern of discretionary violence observed during the period. It is essential to avoid retrojecting later martyr theology into this context. The deaths of Peter and Paul were not framed by Roman authorities as meaningful sacrifices. They were not intended to convey ideological messages beyond deterrence and control. For the Roman state, executions functioned as instruments of order, not as theological statements. Any spiritual interpretation attached to these deaths developed within Christian communities afterward, not within the moment of execution itself. The early Christian sources that mention Peter and Paul do not present elaborate accounts of suffering. They do not dwell on method or spectacle. They emphasize endurance and example rather than narrative detail. This restraint suggests proximity to the events rather than legendary expansion. As memory moved further from the events in time, later traditions would add color and symbolism. The location of Rome matters. Rome was not chosen because it was uniquely hostile to Christianity, but because it was the center of imperial authority and population. Events occurring there carried symbolic weight regardless of scale. The deaths of prominent Christians in Rome resonated across the network of communities connected to the capital. This resonance does not imply strategic intent by the Roman state. It reflects the communicative reality of the empire. It is also important to resist the assumption of coordination. There is no evidence that Peter and Paul were arrested together, tried together, or executed as part of a single event. The convergence of their deaths in tradition reflects temporal proximity rather than procedural unity. The desire for narrative symmetry should not override the fragmentary nature of the evidence. The execution of these figures did not eliminate the Christian presence in Rome. The movement was decentralized and not dependent on a single leader or location. House groups continued to exist. Communication between communities persisted. The Roman state did not attempt systematic eradication. The deaths of Peter and Paul were significant for memory, not decisive for survival. From a Roman perspective, these executions were unremarkable within a broader pattern of punitive action. Individuals were removed. Order was asserted. The machinery of governance continued. From a Christian perspective, the deaths acquired meaning through remembrance and transmission. The historian's task is not to arbitrate between these perspectives, but to place them within their respective contexts. The evidentiary asymmetry between Roman silence and Christian testimony must be maintained throughout the analysis. Roman silence limits claims about procedure, motive, and intent. Christian testimony establishes location, approximate chronology, and communal significance. Where the two intersect, confidence increases. Where they diverge, restraint is required. The significance of these executions lies less in their immediate impact than in their later role in shaping Christian memory. Rome became associated with apostolic death, not because the Roman state intended this association, but because communities remembered and transmitted it. This process occurred over time and cannot be collapsed into the moment of execution. By the end of this period, the Neronian persecution had subsided. The deaths of Peter and Paul did not inaugurate a new phase of repression. They marked the end of an episode rather than the beginning of a policy. The Roman state returned to indifference. Christians returned to obscurity. Memory, however, endured. From 65 AD onward, the reign of Nero entered a phase defined less by individual acts than by cumulative institutional strain. The Roman state did not collapse suddenly, nor did it descend into generalized chaos. Instead, the structures that sustained imperial authority, fiscal confidence, elite cooperation, and military loyalty began to erode in parallel. What emerged was not immediate anarchy, but a progressively fragile system increasingly unable to absorb shock. The consolidation of power earlier in the reign had narrowed decision-making authority around the emperor. This centralization produced efficiency in some contexts, but reduced resilience overall. Where earlier emperors had relied on broader consultation and elite consensus, Nero's later governance depended on personal discretion and selective enforcement. As long as conditions remained stable, this arrangement functioned. When pressures mounted, its limitations became apparent. Fiscal strain was among the earliest and most persistent pressures. Large-scale building projects in Rome required sustained expenditure. Reconstruction following the fire intensified these demands. To meet them, the regime drew more heavily on imperial resources. Coinage debasement followed, reducing the silver content of the denarius. The debasement was not extreme by later standards, nor did it produce immediate economic collapse. Its significance lay elsewhere. Currency served as a symbol of trust between ruler and elite. Alteration of that symbol signaled instability and weakened confidence among those whose cooperation the regime required. Elite confidence was further strained by the continued use of treason prosecutions. While not indiscriminate, these prosecutions reinforced uncertainty. Senators and equestrians adjusted their behavior accordingly, prioritizing survival over engagement. Political participation became cautious and transactional. This erosion of trust did not produce open resistance, but it hollowed out the cooperative foundation of governance. The Senate, though still functioning, no longer operated as a stabilizing partner. Its members were divided by personal interests and shifting allegiances. Collective action was rare. Opposition, where it existed, was fragmented. This fragmentation limited the Senate's capacity to check imperial excess or to serve as a channel for collective grievance. In effect, the institution persisted without exerting meaningful constraint. Administrative continuity masked deeper problems. Provincial governance continued. Taxation was collected. The law was enforced. The empire remained operational. This continuity is essential to understanding the nature of the threat. Nero's reign did not unravel because the state ceased to function. It unraveled because legitimacy weakened while mechanisms of correction failed. Military loyalty proved decisive. Roman emperors ruled not only through law and tradition, but through the confidence of the armies. During the mid-60s, that confidence began to fray. Military discontent did not originate in ideological opposition or moral protest. It arose from uncertainty about leadership reward, and future stability. Commanders assessed risk pragmatically. As confidence in the emperor declined, alternatives became conceivable. Revolts did not erupt simultaneously across the empire. They emerged incrementally. Local commanders responded to regional pressures and opportunities. What united these developments was not coordination, but convergence. Multiple actors independently concluded that Nero's position was vulnerable. Once that conclusion spread, loyalty became conditional. The emperor's response to mounting instability reflected the limitations of centralized authority. With fewer trusted advisors and diminished elite cooperation, decision-making became reactive. Efforts to assert control relied increasingly on coercion rather than consensus. This reliance further eroded legitimacy, creating a feedback loop. Each assertion of power reduced the willingness of institutions to support it. It is important to avoid attributing these developments to personal pathology. Ancient sources often frame Nero's later reign in terms of moral degeneration or madness. Such language reflects elite displacement and retrospective judgment. From an analytical perspective, the more significant factor was institutional imbalance. Power concentrated without corresponding accountability. When stress increased, the system lacked buffers. The political environment of the late 60s AD was characterized by exhaustion. Fiscal capacity was strained. Elite trust was diminished. Military loyalty was uncertain. None of these conditions alone guaranteed collapse. Together, they created vulnerability. In such a context, a single shock could destabilize the regime. That shock came in the form of open revolt. When provincial commanders asserted autonomy, the regime's inability to respond decisively exposed its weakness. Support for the emperor evaporated rapidly once alternatives appeared viable. The speed of this shift underscores how contingent imperial authority had become. Legitimacy, once lost, could not be recovered through force alone. The final phase of Nero's reign illustrates the consequences of systemic erosion. As revolts multiplied and support dwindled, the emperor's options narrowed. Attempts to reassert authority failed to reverse the trajectory. The Senate, sensing the change in balance, withdrew recognition. The political mechanisms that had sustained the principate turned against its holder. In June 68 AD, Nero's reign ended. His death did not result from foreign invasion or popular uprising. It resulted from institutional abandonment. When the emperor lost recognition, his authority dissolved. This outcome reflects the nature of Roman power. Emperors ruled through acceptance as much as through coercion. When acceptance collapsed, so did the rule. The significance of this collapse lies in its structural implications. Nero's reign demonstrates how concentrated authority can become brittle. Centralization without accountability reduces adaptability. In times of crisis, such systems struggle to respond proportionately. They oscillate between inaction and overreaction, undermining confidence further. It is essential to situate episodes of violence during this period within this broader pattern. Acts of repression were not isolated expressions of cruelty. They were manifestations of a regime under strain, attempting to manage legitimacy through force when other tools failed. These actions did not cause collapse, but they signaled it. The end of Nero's reign did not resolve the underlying tensions. Instead, it exposed them. The power vacuum that followed led to rapid succession and civil conflict. This analysis does not absolve Nero of responsibility. It situates responsibility within context. The emperor made choices that concentrated authority, strained trust, and relied on coercion. These choices interacted with structural pressures to produce instability. Understanding this interaction avoids caricature while preserving accountability. By the time Nero's reign ended, the Roman state had not disintegrated, but it had been tested severely. The consequences of that test would unfold in subsequent years. For the period between 65 and 68 AD, the defining feature was not spectacle, but strain. The empire bent under pressure until it could bend no further. The death of Nero in June 68 AD brought an abrupt end to the conditions that had produced violence against Christians in Rome. The executions carried out after the Great Fire were not sustained, institutionalized, or extended beyond his reign. With the collapse of Nero's authority, the specific political calculus that had made Christians useful as scapegoats disappeared. The cessation of persecution was immediate, not gradual, and it occurred without formal announcement or legal reversal. This silence is historically significant. It demonstrates that what had occurred under Nero was not policy, but contingency. The Roman state did not inherit an obligation to continue punishing Christians. No law had been issued. No decree had been recorded. No administrative framework existed that required successors to act. As a result, once Nero's regime ended, the state reverted to its prior position of indifference. Christians did not suddenly become tolerated in a modern sense, nor were they embraced or protected. They simply returned to political irrelevance. The absence of action was not benevolence. It was disinterested. This return to indifference clarifies the nature of the Neronian episode. The violence had not been driven by a developed view of Christianity as a threat to Roman order. It had been driven by the needs of a ruler under pressure. When that pressure vanished, so did the incentive to act. The Roman system was pragmatic. It responded to problems when they emerged and ignored groups that did not require management. Christianity, once again, did not require management. For the early Christian communities in Rome, the aftermath was not marked by institutional transformation or political mobilization. There is no evidence of immediate reorganization in response to persecution. There is no sign of centralized leadership emerging as a defensive measure. House gatherings continued. Social marginality remained. The movement survived not because it adapted structurally, but because it did not depend on structures that could be dismantled. Decentralization proved resilient by default, not by design. The most significant consequence of Nero's actions lay not in immediate Roman behavior, but in precedent. For the first time, The Roman state had demonstrated that Christians could be punished as a group when politically expedient, even in the absence of formal illegality. This demonstration did not create a rule, but it created a memory within administrative culture. It showed what was possible. In Roman governance, possibility mattered. Precedent in Roman practice did not function as binding law. It functioned as an available option. Officials drew on past examples when confronted with new situations. Nero's actions entered this reservoir of examples, not as doctrine, but as experience. The lesson was not that Christians must be punished, but that they could be punished if circumstances warranted it. This distinction is critical. It preserves contingency while acknowledging consequence. It is equally important to recognize what precedent did not do. It did not commit future emperors to a course of action. It did not define Christianity as inherently criminal. It did not produce automatic hostility. The Roman system retained flexibility. Officials continued to exercise discretion based on local conditions, political needs, and personal judgment. Nero's example influenced possibility, not inevitability. For the early church, the immediate impact was memory rather than transformation. Communities remembered violence that had occurred, but that memory did not instantly crystallize into doctrine or identity. Early Christian texts from this period reflect awareness of suffering without systematization. They do not articulate a theology of persecution. They do not treat suffering as destiny. They acknowledge loss without constructing ideology around it. This restraint reflects proximity to events. Memory had not yet hardened into narrative. The deaths of Christians under Nero were known, but their meaning was still fluid. Interpretation would develop over time, shaped by later experiences and subsequent episodes of repression. The Roman state's silence after 68 AD reinforces this point. Had Christianity been perceived as a persistent threat, measures would have continued. They did not. Christians were neither hunted nor protected. They were ignored. This indifference underscores that the earlier violence had been instrumental rather than principled. Once the instrument was no longer useful, it was set aside. The collapse of Nero's regime also altered Roman political priorities. The state entered a period of instability focused on succession and control. Attention shifted toward military loyalty and elite alignment. Marginal religious groups did not command interest. In this environment, Christians receded further from view. Their small numbers and lack of political leverage rendered them invisible once more. This invisibility did not mean safety in an absolute sense. It meant the absence of scrutiny. The Roman system did not monitor Christianity proactively. It responded when provoked. The immediate post-Neronian period provided no such provocation. As a result, Christians experienced neither systematic repression nor legal recognition. They existed in a space of administrative neglect. The significance of Nero's reign for Roman policy logic lies precisely here. The state learned that it could act against Christians without legal reform if circumstances demanded it. It also learned that such action was not necessary absence crisis. Both lessons coexisted. Roman governance remained situational, not programmatic. This duality shaped later encounters without dictating them. Officials confronted Christianity with varying responses depending on context. Some ignored it. Some tolerated it. Some punished it. These responses were not the unfolding of a single policy trajectory. They were discrete decisions informed by local conditions and available precedent. For the early church, survival depended on factors unrelated to imperial favor. The movement did not appeal to power. It did not organize politically. It did not seek legal recognition. Its endurance rested on social networks, shared practices, and adaptability. Persecution neither created nor destroyed these features in the immediate aftermath. The symbolic association between Rome and Christian suffering also developed over time, not instantly. Rome was remembered as the site of executions, but this memory gained prominence as communities reflected on their past. The immediate aftermath was quieter. Reconstruction dominated public life. Political realignment consumed attention. Christian memory persisted internally rather than publicly. The immediate effects can be summarized precisely. Violence ceased. No law remained. Indifference returned. Precedent persisted. Memory endured. These outcomes are modest in scale, but significant in implication. They demonstrate how a brief episode can leave an imprint without reshaping an entire system. The Roman state emerged from Nero's reign altered but intact. Its flexibility remained.